The sound of Vanessa Crow's hand hitting my desk stopped 3 conversations outside my office. Not because it was violent, because everyone on that floor knew what it meant when a woman like Vanessa wanted an audience. She didn't knock. She didn't sit. She left the glass door open on purpose. "You're fired," she said. "Be out before Saturday." 2 assistants froze in the hallway. A manager near the printer stared at his tablet like looking away might keep his name out of it. My name is Evelyn Hart. I'm 41 years old, and I had spent 17 years building the international client relationships that made Halcyon Group look far bigger and far steadier than it really was. For what reason, I asked? Vanessa smiled without warmth. Efficiency? We're done carrying expensive legacy roles just because people got comfortable. Legacy role. That was what she called the work that kept high-value clients from walking the moment someone here confused money with trust. Vanessa had been in power less than a month. Head of strategic optimization. Long title, fast hands. Very little patience for people who knew where the real seams were. "You should be grateful," she said. "Most people get escorted out. I'll manage." I closed my laptop, unplugged it, and slid it toward her. She frowned. "What is this, everything you think you just replaced? For the first time?" Her face changed, only for a second. I stood and picked up my bag. As I reached the door, I heard her voice through the gap in Richard Crow's office. "You see," she said to her husband, "getting rid of her alone saves us $10,000 a month." He didn't argue. That landed harder than the firing, because it meant this wasn't anger. It was a plan. As in every Her Fear story, this one is written to reflect familiar human conflicts. Not any real individual. I left without another word. Not because I was defeated, because not one person in that building had asked the question that mattered most. What had they just placed in Vanessa Crow's hands? And what exactly would happen on Monday morning? A week before Vanessa fired me, she started using one phrase often enough to turn it into a warning: efficiency review. She used it in meetings, in hallways, in emails that pretended to be strategic when all they really meant was someone is about to disappear. At first, it wasn't me. A regional operations manager with 19 years in. Gone. A senior compliance analyst who knew every exception code by memory. Gone. A client logistics coordinator whose mistakes prevented million-dollar losses no one ever saw. Gone. Each exit came wrapped in the same polished language. We're streamlining. We need modernization. We have to stay disciplined on cost. No one ever said ignorance was expensive. Only experience. By the 3rd round, I understood the pattern. Vanessa wasn't cutting weak people. She was cutting people whose value only became obvious during a crisis. That was when I started seeing Chloe Crow everywhere. 24, new graduate program, expensive polish, fast access. Her title was something vague and impressive enough to sound earned. Strategic Leadership Development Track, the kind of name companies invent when they want nepotism to pass as planning. One Tuesday morning, she sat in on a client protocol meeting with a notebook she barely touched. Vanessa pointed at the screen. "From now on, international briefing language will be standardized across accounts. One template, one tone, no more over-customization." "That would be a mistake," I said. Her eyes shifted to me. Why? Because trust is not built the same way in Tokyo, Sao Paulo, and Abu Dhabi. Chloe finally looked up. "But consistency is more scalable, isn't it?" No one answered right away. That was the moment I knew how bad this could get. She thought relationships were formatting. Vanessa folded her arms. "That kind of expensive thinking is exactly what we're removing." The room went quiet, and in that silence, I understood something before I could prove it. I was not the highest salary on her spreadsheet. I was the last barrier between this company and the daughter she meant to install behind my desk. By Monday morning, I was no longer in the building. That was the part Vanessa wanted. The part she hadn't planned for started at 9:32, when Marc Dubois and 3 members of his team stepped off the elevator to finalize the next phase of a $48 million expansion deal. I know the exact time because Lila texted me from reception. "They're here. Chloe is taking them in." I set my phone beside my coffee and waited. 3 minutes later, another message lit up the screen. "No one is sitting." I could see it without being there. The glass conference room, the unopened folders, Chloe Crow in a fitted blazer, smiling too early. Someone beside her trying to make the room feel normal. Then Lila called. They're still standing, she whispered. Mark asked for you the second he walked in. What did Vanessa say? That you were unavailable during this stage of transition. I said nothing. Lila moved closer to the door. Her voice dropped even lower. He just looked at her and said, very calm, "Where is Evelyn Hart?" I leaned back in my chair. And then Vanessa said you were a support function and the account structure remains fully intact. I closed my eyes for 1 second. And Mark, he said, we didn't build this relationship through a template. We built it with her. For a moment, all I heard was the movement in the background. No chairs sliding, no papers opening, no meeting beginning. Then Lila said, Chloe tried to start the deck. He didn't even look at the screen. Are they leaving? Yes. No shouting, no scene, just footsteps. The quiet kind that tells you the decision is already made. By 10:14, another message reached me from the 31st floor. They left. Vanessa looks rattled. CFO just got called into Richard's office. And by then, the whole company knew something. Vanessa Crowe had been too arrogant to price correctly. Halcyon's biggest client had just walked out of the building because I was no longer inside it. By noon, Vanessa had stopped treating the morning as a mistake. She was treating it as a messaging problem. That was how people like her survived bad decisions. They didn't revisit them. They rewrote them. At 12:47, an old contact in HR forwarded me a screenshot with no greeting, no explanation, just one paragraph highlighted. Evelyn Hart demonstrated ongoing resistance to modernization initiatives and created unnecessary dependency in transition-sensitive workflows. I read it twice, then once more. Not because it was complicated, because it was surgical. They weren't describing what happened. They were replacing it. An hour later, Lila sent another message. Daniel is pushing a board update. Savings realized. No mention of client risk. Of course he was. Daniel Price never lied loudly. He moved damage into the right order, then called it discipline. I opened the private archive I had built over the years and started pulling files into a separate folder. Client escalation emails, account-specific briefing notes, approval chains with my sign-off buried beneath layers of official structure. Access histories showing who opened what and when. Protocol documents built for relationships that could not survive generic language. That was the part outsiders never saw. My name was rarely on the front page of a deal. It lived deeper in the structure, in review paths, in private warnings, in the quiet corrections that kept expensive people from insulting even more expensive clients. Halcyon never sold translation. It sold fluency and pretended it was automatic. By late afternoon, my anger had settled into something colder. They weren't just removing me from the building. They were building a cleaner version of why I had to go. As with every Her Fear story, this one is created from familiar social realities, not any real person. They had fired me on Friday. By Monday afternoon, they were already trying to edit the reason. By Tuesday, the damage had stopped looking dramatic. It looked expensive, not the kind Vanessa would recognize on sight. No shouting, no public collapse. Just the quiet kind of failure that starts inside a system and keeps spreading after the people in charge say everything is fine. The first issue came through a contact in legal. A translated clause in an addendum had been softened in the wrong place. Not enough to void the contract. Worse than that, enough to create room for argument. The second came from international partnerships. A formal greeting sequence had been skipped on a call with a major Asian counterparty. Chloe had reportedly decided the old structure was too formal for modern communication. Modern communication. That was one way to describe insulting the wrong person in real time. Then came the third. An escalation chain froze because the new account lead didn't know where a dispute review went after operations and before counsel. That gap had never existed before. Years earlier, I'd built that bridge quietly because delays at that stage had a habit of turning into losses no one could explain later. Lila kept feeding me fragments. Chloe made it worse. She copied the wrong people. Vanessa is blaming execution. Just after noon, the clearest line came through. A middle manager, tired enough to forget fear, had spoken too openly in a conference room Vanessa happened to enter. Evelyn used to catch these before they reached the client. Lila sent the sentence exactly as he said it. I saved the screenshot with the rest. Vanessa had cut him off immediately. Of course, but it didn't matter anymore. The truth had already been said, out loud. This was no longer about one client walking out. The system itself was starting to fail in the exact places only I had ever kept invisible. Tuesday night, I stopped reading the story they were telling out loud and started reading the one they had left behind in timestamps. Metadata first, then access logs, then calendar approvals, then routing notes and org chart drafts no one expected to matter after the final versions were cleaned up. That was where the shape of it appeared. Not in one dramatic document, in a pattern. 3 weeks before Vanessa fired me, Chloe Crow had already been added to a calendar labeled International Client Transition Exposure. 2 weeks later, one of my largest accounts had been quietly attached to a strategy team she had started shadowing. Not formally, not publicly, just enough to test how her name looked near work she had no business touching. I kept digging. An archived org chart draft placed her beside functions she had never led. A meeting request described her as future-facing client continuity support. Then I found the line that made me stop moving. Succession optics favorable if transition appears, modernization led. Daniel had approved the chain. I read it 3 times. Not because I didn't understand it, because I had hoped I was wrong. This was never just about savings. Savings were the excuse. Modernization was the costume. What they were really creating was an opening with my name on it, clean enough to hand to Chloe without calling it what it was. Nepotism, translated into executive language. I didn't send everything. Not yet. Too much information. Too early. Gives weak people room to call the truth emotional. So I built a tighter file instead. Clean timeline, key pages, enough for a board member, counsel, or outside advisor to see the structure without getting lost in the smoke. By the time I closed my laptop, I wasn't angry anymore. I was certain. They had called it cost optimization. The data called it something simpler. They had started clearing the path for Chloe before Vanessa ever slammed her hand on my desk. The meeting was set for 7:30 the next morning and labeled confidential, which at Halcyon usually meant 2 things. The problem was real, and someone still thought it could be hidden. The room held more people than Vanessa wanted. Richard at the head of the table. Daniel beside him, gripping a pen too hard. General counsel with a legal pad open. 3 board members dialed in. 1 in person. Marc Dubois across from them, hands folded, face unreadable. No one offered coffee. That was how I knew the room had already changed sides. Richard opened carefully. We're here to assess account risk and determine whether yesterday's disruption can be resolved. Mark spared him the comfort of vagueness. If Evelyn Hart is not restored to the role that governed our relationship, and he said, the $48 million expansion is withdrawn. After that, our related accounts will be reviewed as well. No one interrupted him. I placed a thin folder on the table and slid copies toward the board seats. This is not personal, I said. It's structural. I walked them through it without drama, workflow maps, final sign-off points, routing notes that placed my review at the last meaningful stage before client exposure. Then the draft org chart with Chloe's name attached to future-facing account continuity before my termination had even been finalized. One board member leaned forward. Who approved this transition before the role was vacated? Daniel looked at Vanessa. Vanessa kept her eyes forward. Another voice came through the speaker. Why was a client-facing succession map created before the employee was removed? Vanessa straightened. That was talent development. Forward planning. We were building modernization capacity. Mark turned to her for the first time. No, he said. You were building replacement optics before securing trust. The room went still. That was the moment the language changed. No longer staffing. No longer restructuring. No longer transition. Governance exposure. By the end of the meeting, no one was debating whether I mattered. The only question left was who knew and moved ahead anyway. They called me back that afternoon. Not to apologize. Not to admit what they had done. To contain it. Richard asked me to come up to the 32nd floor. Same building. Same glass walls. Same careful silence in the hallway. And except now people stepped aside when I passed, as if standing too close to me had suddenly become dangerous. Inside the conference room, Richard stood by the window. General counsel sat at the table with a folder already prepared. We'd like to bring you back. Richard said, Anise, immediately, expanded title. Significant compensation adjustment. Direct reporting access. Full authority to stabilize the international accounts. I looked at the folder but didn't open it. What happens to Vanessa? I asked. He paused. We would adjust reporting lines, he said. This doesn't need to become more disruptive than it already is. General counsel stepped in. Smooth. Careful. There's a path here that protects stability, confidentiality, internal transition. No unnecessary record. We can resolve this with discretion. No unnecessary record. That was the part that almost made me smile. They had seen the files, heard the client, understood exactly what had happened. And still, what they wanted most was not fairness. It was survival. Vanessa untouched. Chloe still protected. Daniel still hidden behind process. Richard slid the folder closer. This is a serious offer. I know, I said. He waited. That's why it's more insulting than the firing. Neither of them spoke. I kept my voice level. You're not asking me to come back because you want to fix the system. You're asking me to help you preserve it. As in every Her Fear story. The people and events here are fictional, created from recognizable human patterns rather than any real individual. Then I stood and left. They had not invited me back to make this right. They had invited me back to help them escape the cost. I sent the full file at 6:12 that evening. Not to Richard. To the board chair and outside counsel. 17 years at Halcyon had taught me one thing. The truth has a better chance when it reaches the people least invested in softening it. This package was tighter than the one I had brought to the first meeting, but far more damaging. It included the timeline showing when Chloe had first been placed near my accounts, the cost savings memo Daniel approved, the revenue risk note he had received 2 days earlier and failed to escalate, the HR language drafted after Mark's walkout, designed to turn my removal into attitude instead of exposure. The follow-up review began the next morning. This time, no one called it a misunderstanding. Outside counsel asked Vanessa a simple question. Was Chloe Crow ever being positioned to assume any portion of Evelyn Hart's client-facing function? Vanessa answered too fast. No, absolutely not. She was in a leadership development track, not a role substitution plan. Counsel nodded and slid a printed calendar note across the table. Client continuity shadowing Chloe Crow. Account transition visibility recommended before staffing action? Vanessa didn't touch the page. Daniel tried next. There was never any formal indication these accounts depended on Evelyn in a way that couldn't be redistributed. That might have worked if his signature had not been sitting at the bottom of the risk note now in front of the board. Outside counsel read the final line aloud. Removal of Evelyn Hart before replacement readiness may trigger direct client instability across revenue-sensitive international accounts. After that, the room changed. Not confusion, not debate, consequence. One board member closed her copy of the file and looked at Richard. This is no longer a personnel matter. No one corrected her, because they couldn't. The story had moved beyond staffing, beyond optics, beyond the family language they had hidden inside polished process. It was now in the record, and once the truth entered the file, the question was no longer who was right. It was who could still be trusted with power. By the time the board called me back in, the $48 million deal was gone. Not delayed, gone. 2 more international accounts had paused their reviews, and the silence around Halcyon had changed into something far more expensive, fear with numbers attached to it. They had already offered everything that should have worked on paper. More money, more title, more authority, direct access to the board, written protection against arbitrary termination. It was a polished way of saying, name your price, but that had never been the problem. Never. The problem was not that they had undervalued me. It was that their system had allowed family power to outrank competence, then tried to hide the damage behind words like transition and modernization. The final meeting was smaller than the others. Board chair, outside counsel, Richard, no Vanessa, no Chloe, no Daniel. Before we proceed, the chair said, we need your terms. I didn't open the folder in front of me. If I return, Vanessa Crow is terminated effective immediately. No one spoke. Chloe Crow is also terminated and removed from every succession track, rotational program, and client-facing development path. The chair wrote it down, and Daniel Price is removed from all approval authority involving staffing, restructuring, or client risk decisions. Richard exhaled, but he did not argue. Then I gave them the only condition that really mattered. This company adopts a governance rule prohibiting members of the same family from working in the same organization when staffing. Strategy, succession, or power can be influenced across family lines. Outside counsel looked up. Your basis, governance protection. I said, to prevent this from ever happening again. That was the line that entered the record. No one in that room could oppose it. The file had already shown what family access looked like when no one stopped it. I signed only after the clause was written into the final document. Then I set the pen down on the same table Vanessa had once struck to throw me out. They thought this began when she fired me. It ended when the company learned something far more expensive than my salary. I did not come back for a title. I came back to make sure her family could never do this here again.